ברוכים הבאים כולם, ערב טוב למי שבארץ, צהריים טובים למי שבאמריקה, ובאמצע לכל השאר. תכף דוקטור סטון יציג לנו ויספר לנו על טוויטר, ואני רק אזכיר שזה ערב שאורגן במסגרת נייל סטון, שזה ארגון שהוא הבית מדענים ורופאים ישראלים בחו"ל, ואנחנו מארגנים אירוע in person שאולי נדב, המנכ"ל של הארגון, ירצה להגיד עליו כמה מילים לפני שאנחנו מתחילים. נדב, זה הפיל שלך.
תודה. אז קודם כל תודה רבה מעיין א' על האירוע הזה ועל היוזמה הזאת, זו יוזמה חשובה, כמה שיותר מפגשים לקהילת הרופאות והרופאים. אני באמת יעלה 2 דקות, אתם רואים אני פה עם סינר, יש לנו ערב פיצות בבית, אבל היה חשוב לי לעלות כדי לדבר איתכם. ב-22 בספטמבר אנחנו מקיימים יום על רפואה ישראלית פורצת דרך. היום הזה יתקיים בניו יורק בשיתוף פעולה עם בית החולים שיבא, עם הרי ועם נפש בנפש. יחד איתנו הצטרפו בית החולים הדסה, בית החולים שניידר, ועוד כמה גופים מובילים בישראל ובחו"ל. המטרה היא לחשוף את מה שקורה במדינת ישראל לקהל ישראלי, יהודי, ציוני, שמדינת ישראל מעניינת אותו, ולחבר אתכם לאקוסיסטם של מה שקורה, ומי שמתעניין בחזרה לארץ, אז כמובן וכמובן, וזו ההזדמנות לבוא ולפגוש קולגות, חברים, באמת הבכירים שבבכירים, בית חולים רמב"ם, המנכ"ל שלו יגיע, מנכ"לית שניידר, כנראה מנכ"ל שיבא, ונציגים של עוד הרבה בתי חולים, פרופסור דינה בן יהודה, יושבת ראש ועדת סל התרופות מהדסה. הטופ שבטופ, כשאת היום יפתח פרופסור אהרון צ'חנובר, זוכה פרס נובל, וזה יום מאוד מעניין. אני יודע שצירפו לכם פה בצ'אט את הלינק וקצת מידע על הכנס. אני אשמח שתיכנסו לאתר שלנו, תירשמו. לרופאים זה עולה משהו כמו, אם אני זוכר נכון, $36, זה early bird, אנחנו עושים רישום מקדים 50% הנחה על עלות הכנס. העלות היא נועדה רק באמת לייצר מחויבות, אז אם אתם רופאים ישראלים שנמצאים באזור ב-22 בספטמבר, יותר נשמח לראות אתכם יחד איתנו, ואנחנו נשמח שגם תיקחו את הלינק הזה, תעתיקו אותו ותפיצו אותו בקבוצת הוואטסאפ של הקהילות, של החברים, תעבירו אותו לעוד אנשים. זה אירוע באמת מאוד מאוד איכותי, מאוד משמעותי, ואנחנו רוצה שכמה שיותר אנשים ייהנו ממנו. אנחנו עובדים עליו מאוד קשה, ונשמח שכמה שיותר אנשים יוכלו לנצל את ההזדמנות וליהנות ממנו. אז תודה רבה, ואם יש שאלה אני אשמח לענות, אני אחכה עוד רגע לשמוע מהשאלות, ואם לא אז אני אשאר אתכם לערב החשוב והמעניין הזה. אנחנו בסדר.
נראה שכן. תודה נדב.
תודה.
אז אנחנו נעבור לנייל. את נייל הכרתי בטוויטר, ולכן חשבתי שזה באמת הדמות המתאימה ביותר כדי להעביר את ההרצאה הזו על הרשת החברתית שכבר לא נקראת טוויטר אלא נקראת אקס, ועל כמה שהיא חשובה ובאמת איש שמאוד מעורב בתחום ושמשלב מאוד טוב את הנושא הזה של חשיפה למחקר, לחינוך רפואי בתוך התוכנית הזאת. אז הבמה שלך, ניל, תרגיש חופשי, אנגלית, עברית, כולם מבינים הכל, מה שנוח לך.
תודה רבה מעיין. קודם כל אני מקווה שכולם יכולים לשמוע אותי ולראות אותי, או לפחות את השקופיות. כן?
שומעים?
יופי, אז אני אמשיך. אז קודם כל אני אספר לכם טיפה על הרקע האישי שלי. אני נולדתי בגלזגו בסקוטלנד, לקהילה היהודית הקטנה מאוד שם. עלינו לארץ, המשפחה שלי, שהייתי רק תינוק, אז גדלתי שם בתור ילד קטן בבאר שבע, וחזרנו לסקוטלנד ואז ללונדון, אבל תמיד שמרתי קשר עם הארץ, והיום אני נשוי לישראלית, ועשיתי גם חלק מהמחקר שלי באוניברסיטת תל אביב. אז היום אני הולך לדבר על נושא אולי פחות רציני, קצת קליל יותר, אולי כיפי, ואני חושב זה מתאים כרגע כי יש מספיק נושאים כבדים ולא פשוטים כרגע לכולם. קצת משהו כיפי יותר זה לא יזיק. וגם אם תרשו לי, אני הולך עכשיו לעבור לאנגלית, זה הרבה יותר נוח לי. So I'm going to do a switch now to English. It's much easier for me to do a presentation in English, but I hope at the end, if you want to ask me some questions, I'd be happy to try and switch back to Hebrew. So I'm going to talk to you about social media and using it in medicine and science. And hopefully it'll be fun. It's not going to be very long. You might get some tips which might make you use it more. Some of you might use it already. But hopefully I can persuade you that it's actually quite a useful thing professionally beyond all of the nonsense that we see a lot on social media. So I'm going to tell you about my personal journey on Twitter, which is now, of course, called X, how to make the most of it, particularly thinking about medicine and science. But also, of course, we can't ignore the dark side. And there really is, unfortunately, a dark side to all social media, in particular Twitter or X. And then I'm going to just finish up by giving you some tips of how to do it better and how to get a bigger following. So this is my profile page. So you can see here I've got quite a lot of followers now, 42.2 thousand. And for sure that is far more than I ever expected to do when I started. I just started it 2017, actually, just for myself, just for fun, just to follow things. Really, I had no idea that it would kind of explode into the number of followers that I've got now. And it happened like a lot of these things, and like a lot of science, actually, the best things sometimes happen by accident. Now, one of the reasons for that is, and you'll see why it got so big, was, of course, COVID. Now, I'm an infectious disease specialist. My favorite are fungi. I like parasites. Bacteria are okay. And viruses are probably, to me, the least interesting part of infectious diseases. But of course, we all know what happened in the last few years with the massive pandemic. And the next slide I'm going to show you is a word cloud. So these are the most common words that I've used in my Twitter feed. And you can see there, pretty obviously, in the middle is the word COVID. And that word itself has significance for me in relation to Twitter as well. So this really became a COVID account. And it's not surprising that in my job, at the start of the pandemic, a lot of people were suddenly interested in this new disease and started to follow me. And I think you can probably see that quite clearly on this graph. So, okay, it's a light, fun topic, but this is a scientific meeting. So I've got to have a little bit of graphs, a little bit of data, but very much not heavy data at all. So along the bottom is the year. So you can see I joined in 2017 with no followers. I was tweeting mainly about fungus, which, as you can imagine, is quite a niche topic. There are only a few people who are kind of interested in that. And I had a few followers, a few hundred, maybe the low thousands. But of course, COVID came along, and the first case was in December of 2019. And you can see how things took off after that. It was a real twist of history. So I finally became a specialist in infectious diseases in my first day at work as a consultant, which is the equivalent of an attending in London. It was on the 19th of December 2019. And 3 days later, which was in December, so December 22nd, 2019, the first case of this mystery pneumonia was actually admitted to Wuhan in China. So it was really a good luck or bad luck to exactly start my career as a senior exactly then, of course, coincided with a massive pandemic. But of course, everyone was interested in this. We were seeing the first cases. We were testing people coming back from China. We were coming back to London, which, as everyone knows, is a very international city. So there was a huge interest. And then very quickly, early in the pandemic, I got given the famous or infamous blue check or blue tick, as we call it in the UK, וכמדען, infamously. And suddenly there was an explosion of interest, and my follower account just took off from them. So it really became a COVID account because there was so much interest at the time. So it was luck, I guess. And you can see here, it really did depend on what was going on with COVID at the time. So along the top here, the red line, that's the new followers I was gaining every month from July 2020 through to April 22, which was the absolute peak of the pandemic worldwide. And along the bottom, these were the number of active cases of COVID in the UK at the time. And that's when everyone, remember, was obsessed with case numbers in these graphs. And you can see it follows quite carefully. So the more COVID there was around, the more people were thinking about it and more people were interested in what I had to say about it on Twitter, because we were seeing this new disease. I was seeing cases on the wards and just describing what I was seeing, and people were interested. So who were those people following me? So like any business really, or brand, and we all are in a way personal brands. So whether it's in medicine or science of any kind, we've got to sell ourselves in terms of who do we want to listen to our work? We want to publicize our work. We want it to be known. We don't just do it for ourselves, or at least most of us don't. We want to share it. And so these are where the followers come from. So half, unsurprisingly, are from the UK. 20% are from the USA, and a smattering of other countries. And you can see Israel's quite well represented given the population size, but mostly from the UK, of course, not surprisingly. The male-female split of my followers is about even, and about 5% of my followers are not people at all, but they're businesses or groups, which are, of course, are important users of Twitter. What I think is much more important, though, is what is their background? Okay, so were these fellow professionals, were these lay people, people in the public who just wanted to hear about what was going on? And the answer, it was a mix. And this is really, really important. When you give a talk to any audience, so when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, well, who am I talking to? These are scientists, doctors. We all know it's completely different if you give a talk to a first-year medical student and a senior professor. The expectations are completely different. And you have to think about that with your content. So what's interesting is that about a third of these patients were in healthcare, a third of people who were following me were in healthcare, and about 20% in science and technology. And between them, about half my followers are, I guess, unsurprisingly, in my field of health and science. So very much looking for a professional opinion, wanting to hear, I guess, about the medicine or the science. But half of them are not, from every kind of profession, law, the arts, culture, just the general public who wanted to know more. It's really important to know who you're talking to. I think it's important to stay on message and remember why people are following you. And if you go off that, things change really rapidly. And I think this graph kind of shows that quite well. So along the top are the new followers I get, and along the bottom in red are people who unfollow me. And what you'll notice is it goes up and down quite a lot. Hopefully you gain more than lose followers, but you can see this spike here on the right. And this is exactly around the middle to end of October. And we all know what happened on that terrible day in October. And I started to post about the issue and about Israel and the conflict, because of course it was very personal to me. But unsurprisingly, I lost a lot of followers, people who either didn't agree with me, or a lot of people who just didn't want to hear that from me. There's so many experts out there, so many sources. I'm not an expert on it. Of course, I have my views like everybody else, but people were following me to hear about COVID initially, maybe fungus, science, healthcare, not about an event like that, which of course affected me. I didn't have anything really special to say about it as compared to other experts. So I lost a lot of followers. Interestingly, I also gained a lot, so it kind of evened out. So what actually happened was there was a bit of a shift. There were people who maybe agreed with my views on the whole conflict, or people who just started following for that reason. But bear that in mind. You should try and stay on message according to your audience. So it's important to know who you're talking to. Not only on Twitter, of course, in any walk of life, but even more so on social media, which is all about communicating with your audience. Numbers also are not the most important thing. It's about the quality of the followers. And what do I mean by quality? So if you look at this, I use this online program to kind of assess the quality of the people who follow me, those 42,000 people. High quality, which is only about 5%. That's people who are verified, people who have a lot of followers, a lot of influence, and are very active. That's a small percentage. The majority, I'm pleased to say, are normal, like you and me and most people who use it a lot, people who interact and engage and have moderate size following. What you want to avoid is having low quality, and that's yellow. That's people who do exist, but they hardly use the medium. They're basically not on it. We all know people like that who maybe signed up to an account but barely check it and don't interact. But the worst of all, which is a real growing problem across a lot of social media, are accounts which actually don't exist at all. They're not real people. They're completely fake. They're often bots. And I'll show you some examples of that. So I get a rating of about 71%, which is pretty good. Interestingly, some of the massive accounts out there, if you did this, a huge percentage of them would be bots or fake accounts that they've maybe paid for. The numbers are really quite incredible. So this is something which actually kind of shocked me at the beginning. So COVID happened. We were seeing the first cases in all of the UK. There was lots of interest. But then I had a look at actually not just the number of interactions and people messaging me or following me or liking my posts, but the number of people who were just seeing my tweets. And the numbers were actually quite incredible. So this was the peak of the COVID pandemic. So in July of 2021, I got nearly 10 million impressions. So there were nearly 10 million people, or at least 10 million times, where people read what I had to say. And that was exciting, and at the same time, a little bit frightening. And it made me realize this was an incredibly powerful medium. So if you think about in our world of medicine or science, we might publish a paper, hopefully. That's a very niche, small audience of people who read that journal. Or if you give a talk in a conference or a meeting like this, it's a small niche number of people. But suddenly I was reaching people in the millions, at least in terms of how many people were interacting. So that made me focus my mind and think, okay, people are going to react to what I say here. And there's a level of responsibility there when you've got that kind of reach. So here's an example. This was my most ever read single tweet, January 2021. This is when the vaccine was just being rolled out. And I don't know what it was like in Israel. I know you had a very fast rollout there. We had difficult rollout in the beginning in the UK where only very few people could get access to it. And there was kind of a fight to get there first. And all I said was something I thought very simple, just saying at the end of the day, rather than throw them out, we should give it to anyone who wants. Because at that time, there were stories of unused vaccine being thrown out rather than people getting them who wanted it. I thought that was a very obvious thing to say, but it was viewed 2.1 million times. And sometimes in Twitter, all you have to do is just state the obvious and you get a lot of traction for that, because sometimes the obvious things are not said when they need to be. So that was my most read tweet, but this is probably my most famous and impactful single tweet ever. So believe it or not, this was what I tweeted in February 2020, and I posted it. This is officially the first ever use of the word COVID in the English language, believe it or not. It's actually true. So if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, which is the official dictionary of the English language, and you look up the word COVID, it says this was first written by נייל Stone in February 2020. So even if I achieve nothing else in the rest of my career, at least I have that for all of history. And of course, like most things, it was a complete accident. I said the novel coronavirus has how been named COVID. So there was even a typo in there. Forevermore, I can never change that now. There's something symbolic about that, but I'm not quite sure what it is. What had happened was the WHO had named this new disease and this new virus COVID-19. And I immediately reported this because I had heard that from someone who was working at the WHO that they call it COVID-19. I said, it's been named COVID. But by accident, complete accident, I dropped the 19. So I was the first ever person to write COVID with no 19. But anyway, it's mine forever and no one's taking that away from me. So that was quite a fun and bizarre thing which has come out of this strange world of social media. At one point, my boss in my new job, the manager of the hospital, so University College Hospital, which is in the centre of London, they took me aside and they'd noticed I was getting a lot of traction on social media at the time and said to me, she said, נייל, what's your comms strategy? And I looked at her and I thought, what are you talking about? I don't have a comms strategy. I just say what I see. Whatever I think, I just put it out there. But of course, she was right. You do need to have a strategy, especially when you gain a following. Either to get a following or once you have it, to use it properly. And now, of course, it's matured quite a bit. We're 3-4 years on now. And in my field, at least of infectious diseases, colleagues of mine actually tried to put this together in a formal way and publish this digital strategy for social media and infectious diseases. And, it doesn't have to be ID. It can be any specialty or any field of science at all. The principles are exactly the same. And they actually categorized it really nicely into the different ways that social media can be used in science. And so they spoke about education, which is extremely important, combating misinformation, which is vital. We all know how much fake news is out there, clinical care, and I'll show you some examples of that. And what I think is really, really important and has been really useful for me is professional development. For example, I'm speaking to you now because of a connection I made with Marianne on social media. And there's patient advocacy as well. So patient groups can actually promote what's important to them and interact with doctors. So I've kind of taken that and I've made it even more simple because my mind thinks in a very simple way. And I talk about the 4 E's of X or Twitter. People still call it Twitter. I don't think it'll ever fully go over to X. So it can be educational, for sure, entertaining, but also sadly excruciating and exasperating. So starting with the educational aspect, and this is a huge part of using social media in science and medicine, on really any field. So some examples of this are paper reviews. And what's amazing is, okay, we all know about journal clubs, we all read papers, we all discuss them and critique them. What's really incredible about Twitter is that when you're doing, say, an online journal club and people are discussing it, well, 2 things. Firstly, it's global. So normally you'll be used to journal clubs within your lab or in your department or in your group. But of course, online now and on Twitter or X, it can be all around the world with people with very different perspectives. What I think is the most amazing thing about it is the actual authors of the paper are usually on Twitter. And there have been some amazing occasions where people have been arguing about did they mean this? Did they mean that? I think this was a mistake. And then the author himself or herself jumps in and says, no, 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 let me clarify. And that just makes the experience so much better. Or people who maybe reviewed that paper and say, yeah, I gave this a good review because of A, B, and C. So it takes it to a new level, and it's an incredibly powerful tool. I also work in microbiology, clinical microbiology. So we do what are called bench rounds, where we actually teach trainees what bacteria, for example, look like, which is very visual and lends itself very well to social media. And we can also use Twitter for what we call tweetorials, and I'll show you some examples of that. And of course, in medicine, thinking about clinical cases, either learning cases or clinical problems, which people from all around the world can pose a question. What do I do with this patient? What do people recommend? And all sorts of people from different specialties and backgrounds chip in with what they think is useful. Here's some really good examples. This is a really sad story, actually. Francisco Marti, who's a brilliant ID physician in the States, who sadly died in a tragic accident. He was one of the most brilliant users of Twitter when I started it. And he would use these very visual, comical tweets to actually give a very, very insightful and critical breakdown of some of the papers that were really, really important for clinical practice or important in your field of science. Because, you know, we all need to read papers. We try and read them when we can, but sometimes you just want that bite-sized explanation from someone who's read it and will give you a detailed critique. And Twitter's really, really good for that. You can do it on your phone on the go, and it's very well laid out. Journal clubs, I've mentioned, journal clubs happen all over the world in every single format, but Twitter takes it to that next level. Like I said, you get the authors involved, which is really incredible, which is something which just wasn't possible before. Here's an example of bench rounds in microbiology. So pictures of plates and cultures, and of course, it's very visual. And I've hosted some of these, and we have students and trainees from all over the world coming in with questions and answers. And it's a very safe environment. You can obviously do it from your own home, and it breaks down hierarchies. It's much, much less intimidating than being in a room and putting your hand up, or even being, on Zoom like we are now, where people can see your face. It makes things much more accessible, and I think it's a really, really incredibly useful tool for education. And that's best used, I think, in something called a tweetorial, for those of you who are familiar with it. So you have threads. The thread is a sequence of tweets or posts, whereas a tweetorial is using that thread to tell a story for educational purposes, and it works really, really well. And again, it's all about flattening of hierarchies. So certainly in most places in the world, science and medicine is extremely hierarchical. So if you go to an international conference, there are always the big professors. It's often huge. You can't get near them. It's only a small kind of elite group who get anywhere near the most senior people in the field. But it breaks that down. It means you can access people, you can message them, they'll interact with you. And here's an example of a medical student from Brazil who gave an amazing tutorial about leptospirosis, which is a bacterial infection. I think you call it akberet in Hebrew, which is very common in Brazil, and we don't see it very much. And she just gave a beautiful explanation of it. And that was something which would be very, very hard for someone in her position in that part of the world who's junior to access a global audience. So it really smashes down those hierarchies and those glass ceilings. That's all extremely positive. Clinical cases are quite widely used on Twitter. Of course, we always have to think about patient confidentiality and not reveal too much information. Also, there's an issue of governance, of who takes responsibility for the treatment decisions. Putting that aside, it can be really useful for difficult clinical cases. So again, just taking my field of infectious diseases, and people use this tag ID Twitter in our field. This is a physician in the US. I think he's based in Kentucky, where Marianne is right now by chance, who often puts out these cases. You can use polls. What do people think? People can give in their expert advice, and it can be incredibly useful and rewarding. Although bearing in mind, you have to be careful that there are often legal implications for giving advice on a case you don't have all the details for. So you have to be very clear the confidentiality, and that ultimately the treating physician has the ultimate responsibility for making that treatment decision. Next is professional development. I think this is the most interesting part, and for me personally, it's been the most valuable, which is really networking. So it's a social network, and it's all about making connections, and in a way which, as I've mentioned, flattens that hierarchy, making it much more accessible to people who would be very difficult to access otherwise. And there are any number of ways you can use this. Of course, job adverts are put out on Twitter, so you might see them before anyone else, whereas historically it would be on websites or on journals. Grant calls are really, really important. Often there are webinars advertised for grants. Grant calls come up early, and they're targeted towards who you follow. So I find that very useful. Courses can be advertised, talks, and you're reaching a big audience here. Again, historically, it would be in maybe an email trail or a small conference. You just get a much wider audience. And of course, networking. So I've made some absolutely amazing contacts, colleagues, friends, people who I would not have met otherwise from all around the world. And of course, there are all the professional organizations, all have a Twitter presence. These are some of the ones that we use in our field of ID, and they're very, very useful sources of information. So it just brings everything together in one place, and makes it really often quite rewarding in terms of a professional space. It's also really useful for actual active research. For example, we're part of a multinational trial called SNAP trial about Staphylococcus aureus infection. And we now have there's a Twitter profile where everyone can interact, ask about the study, and we can share updates from that as well. It's incredibly useful, particularly in the trial. There are sites actually in Israel, Australia, Singapore, Canada, the US. So it's really global. And it's much easier communicating on a platform like this instead of trying to have a Zoom call, which is at 3 o'clock in the morning for some people. Beyond that and making connections and adverts, there are some really concrete outputs from this. For example, this is a letter which we wrote to the Lancet Microbe, which in our field is one of the biggest journals, the most impactful journals. And this was purely as a result of Twitter. So there was something called mucormycosis, which is a fungal infection, which exploded after the COVID pandemic, particularly in India. And a few of us, including a colleague from India, who I've never met in person, and a colleague who is in Canada, had some conversation on Twitter, and we decided to write a letter. So we did, and it was published. So that came about purely because of that Twitter connection. So here it is. And moreover, if you look here in the corner with plum X metrics, we all think of metrics as impact factor, how many times your paper is cited, but more and more and more, you can actually see how many times it is cited on social media. So if you click on that, some of you may have seen this already, it tells you how many tweets it's had and how many shares and likes. It's now being used as a metric in science, and eventually may take over completely from impact factor. So as I said, you get invited to meetings like this one. I'm talking to you now because of Twitter. I've been invited to several of the big conferences to talk about this topic, which is something which would never have happened before. So it really does open doors. I was asked, for example, to write this paper, Social Mycology. So again, my small field of mycology, fungal infection, I was asked to write about how to best use social media networks in managing these infections. So all this came about purely from social media, and these are concrete outputs. It's quite funny as well. Sometimes there's lots of humor in there. This is somebody called Dr. Glaucomflecken, you might have seen, who's a really funny and witty. He's actually an ophthalmologist in the US, and he makes fun of all the different specialties in medicine, which most of us can relate to around the world. So that's just a bit of fun. It's also fun in the sense that you get to connect with some famous people and celebrities. Again, in the height of the pandemic, I had Martina Navratilova, some of you who might know about tennis. She was a legend of tennis, certainly when I was growing up as a little boy. And she's a legend, and millions and millions of followers, and she retweeted me, which was just kind of fun. Mehdi Hassan is a journalist who's quite well known, right? I don't particularly like, but anyway, he retweeted me as well. It is quite fun. It's a novelty to make connections with celebrities and interact with them and realize that people who are well known are following what you do, which I never expected, which is, to be honest, quite a bit of fun as well. So these are my followers who've got the most followers themselves. There's someone called John Cena, who's got 14 million followers. I don't even know who he is. Apparently he's something to do with wrestling. Sanjay Gupta, who's on CNN all the time as a medical correspondent, he follows me, and a few others. So that's kind of all a little bit of fun, and it's something which would be impossible before the world of social media, that well-known people with huge public followings would have anything to do with an infectious disease doctor who deals mainly with fungal infections. It's also a really good way of connecting with journalists. Okay, so that has led to a lot of media opportunities. Again, something which I never ever expected. So this is a screenshot of me on the news, Channel 12 in Israel, which I'm sure lots of you watch. I actually gave this interview in Hebrew, which I was proud of. Again, it was about COVID. I made a connection with one of the journalists, Elad Simchayov. Some of you might know. He's a London correspondent for Channel 12. So he had me on the news, which is quite fun, kind of nerve-wracking. Also, I was on his podcast, which is Bayom. Some of you might have listened to that as well. So all of these opportunities come about purely because of Twitter and no other way. There's no other way which I would have contacted people, certainly in the media. And it kind of exploded. So even other topics, the BBC contacted me about The Last of Us. I don't know if you've seen it. It's an HBO series about a fungal pandemic. And they found me on Twitter because I became known as a fungal expert. And I did a radio show for them. I did a piece on their website. Also something about Candida auris, which is a fungal superbug, multi-drug resistant Candida, which is sweeping the world. So they already knew me. So the journalist came back to me and asked if I wanted to do something on Candida auris. I was on the Radio 4, which is really widely listened to news station here. And it just kind of blew up from there. So I found, particularly during COVID, I had all these journalists following me, sending me messages, and it was really quite flattering and exciting, I have to admit. I was quoted in articles in Forbes magazine, Fortune magazine, sadly not because of how much money I make, but because of something I'd said about fungal infection. And this is the Wall Street Journal. So they did a little article about how I was completely accidentally the first person ever to say the word, or at least type the word COVID. So I never imagined this would happen. And all of that, I guess, was fun and flattering and kind of exciting. Because you never expect to be in the world of celebrity or media in a field like infectious diseases. But also, again, it's about your brand and getting known and getting your work out there, and funders notice and colleagues notice and people invite you to talk in places. So it's really, really, it can be really, really useful. It does have a downside. So sometimes people, certainly journalists, will use tweets and use it in their articles without any permission at all. So this happened several times. So this was one in the Telegraph, which is one of the biggest newspapers in the UK. And they didn't ask my permission for that. This was something about what our health secretary, essentially our most senior doctor in the UK, who happened to work with me at the time. I said something about him, and the Daily Mail, which is the big newspaper, used this tweet without my permission. So you have to be very careful, because I think it's well known that journalists can be very sneaky and they can twist things and use things in a way which is not how you wanted them to be represented. And they can do this because one of the downsides is when you publish something on social media, it's public property. There's no copyright at all. So they can freely use whatever they want. They don't have to tell you. They don't have to pay you. They don't have to ask your permission, and they can use it any way they want. So you have to be a little bit careful what you say. And also bear in mind, your boss is watching what you write. Your patients are watching what you write. So there is that responsibility. You always have to think, how might this be perceived by someone else and taken in the wrong way? And people have certainly done some very stupid things by accident or by design, and have got into real trouble. It's also really useful at conferences in particular. So believe it or not, somebody made a map of all the tweets and how they were all connected to each other. This was after one of the conferences, so ECCMID, which is the major infectious disease conference of the year in 2022. And I found out that using particular hashtags for those conferences, that I've been the top ECCMID conference social media influencer for 3 years in a row. I was most proud of the one in the middle 2 years ago when I wasn't even there. I couldn't go. It was in, where was it? It was in Copenhagen. I couldn't go. I was just following online and retweeting and commenting on what I was reading, and still ended up the top influencer. So again, it's about connections, it's about educating, and it's about networking, and it's an extremely powerful tool if you learn how to use it correctly to your advantage. Okay, now the dark side of social media. It's really, really important, actually. So we hear about trolls all the time. We all know what that is, and of some of the really nasty stuff that you see on social media. And certainly at the height of the COVID pandemic, I was getting messages which I never imagined I would ever in my life. So there were the anti-vaxxers, COVID deniers, people who thought I was just being paid by pharma to sell vaccines and I was trying to kill people. Common themes were the Nuremberg trials 2022. Somebody said here, Neil will 100% be on trial at some point this decade. You shouldn't have shelled a potentially lethal novel vaccine. So this is all really horrible stuff, as you can imagine. When all I was trying to do was to get myself through the pandemic, which was kind of scary, get my patients through, and give people advice as I saw it, and had all this incredibly nasty stuff coming my way. Here I was called this disgusting Nazi. So I never thought I would be called such things in my life. Unfortunately, this has all got a lot worse again for anyone who has got anything to do with Israel online recently. Unfortunately, there's a lot of this stuff now related to the conflict, but it was particularly bad during the COVID period. One thing I did learn about myself was, and I guess I surprised myself at the time, that it didn't really bother me. These are names and nasty and unpleasant. I was never threatened physically, which some colleagues were, which is incredibly frightening. And I actually had to get the police involved. But for me, it was just kind of name calling and people saying unpleasant things. One thing I really learned about myself is a person that didn't bother me at all. So that's not that I don't care what people think of me. Of course I do, but I do professionally. And someone said to me once that never worry about criticism from someone who you would not take advice from. And I always thought that I would be really upset if someone I respected said something negative. When it's someone I don't respect, it really didn't bother me at all. And I learned about that I could handle it. It didn't bother me. I could just brush it off. But of course, there are many people who find this incredibly disturbing. And if you do, leave it. There's just no, it's not important enough to be on social media that you have to deal with these kind of horrible, threatening words. You're quite literally evil. Somebody called me a Russian asset. I was called all sorts of things, but I actually kind of turned it around to almost humor. It was so ridiculous that I just didn't really take it seriously. Yeah, more examples. There's just so many examples of that. I could go on and on and on. So it's a really nasty side of things. And of course, it's still there. So I'm just going to finish up in the last few minutes just to give you my top tips that if you either do use Twitter or X and you're going to want to try and expand your following for all the reasons I've shown you, or maybe you've decided that it's a ridiculous thing that you don't want to touch, but you decide you might just start. Here's some tips, I think, just to make your interactions better and get more followers. Read the tweet before you send it. So it's really important, as I said, think about how it's going to be received, not just for you, but for your family, for your patients, for your boss, for the media, because some people have really got into terrible trouble. There was an incident a few years ago in the UK when people were just learning to use this medium, where there was a group of doctors that was very innocent. It was a new group of doctors in a hospital ward. And they said, first day on the respiratory unit of whatever hospital, and completely by accident in the background, they had the patient list with all the names. And they put that out to the public. And that was a major breach of confidentiality. And that was extremely serious. Of course, that's an extreme example, but just stop, read your tweet before you send it and think about how that's going to come across. The worst tweets are when you do it in anger or frustration or do something which you think might be funny to you, but might not be to other people. And because of that, I always say that the best tweet is the one you never sent. Many, many times I've been infuriated or enraged or angered by something. I've typed something in anger, I've been about to press send, and I've just stopped. I guess that's exactly the same with email, and we've all done it before, when we've maybe sent an email in frustration or anger and it's not ended well. I've said here there's no edit button. There wasn't until very recently. So it used to be that when a mistake went out, that was it. And my famous COVID tweet has got a typo forevermore. And I showed you an example before. Tweet what's obvious to you. It might not be to others. So I said something about vaccines, which to me was extremely obvious, but no one had really said it and got huge traction and attention. I've already mentioned this a little bit, know your audience. So I think try and stick to what you're trying to talk about. Here's just another graph of my followers per month, cumulative followers, weekly followers. And you can see here there's a dip around October. Because of what happened in October, I switched topics and started talking about what happened. I did lose followers because, as I said, either people just didn't agree with me or were against what I believe, or maybe they just thought, you know what, I don't follow you for that. There's other people who can tell me about that particular topic. So I think probably it is good to just stick on message and what your audience is. There are ways to actually write a really good post, and this is what I call the anatomy of a tweet. So just some tips when you're starting, just to make it more effective. So we know that pictures always draw attention. So start with a visual, it's just much more attractive. You can put in links. So here's an example where there's a picture, there's a link to a paper, and tag in the authors. So in the world of science, this is a really good example. So you start with your headline and your topic, tag the authors because they're involved in any discussions, and they're going to want to promote their paper and promote discussions. So they will post this on further to their followers. So this is a really, really effective tweet. If you just type something just with words, it always gets much less attention. So this is just technically what is actually being shown to work best. Time of day is really, really important. So here's an analysis that I did online of when people engage most with my posts. Now, obviously, this is very important depending on where you are in the world and where your followers are. So this is UK time or European time. And you can see that most of the activity is in the afternoon, kind of 5 o'clock in the evening to around 9 o'clock. That's when people are finishing work, they're going home. Certainly in London, lots of people get the train home and are on their phones the entire way. The worst time is, middle of the day usually. It seems to be early morning here, but for me, certainly, if I post something at 11 o'clock in the morning, it completely sinks without trace. There's no engagement and interaction. People are usually in the middle of their working day, they're in meetings, and they're not wasting time on this kind of thing. So often it's on their way to work, on their commute, or on their way home. And it's remarkably important when you actually send these tweets out. So peak times, 8:30 in the morning, 5:30 in the evening, are really, really useful. As I said, link pictures, they're really popular. You can try some humor. It's hit and miss. Some people find it funny, some people don't, but I guess that's just the same with real life. But really, really important, never forget confidentiality and medical ethics. As I said, some people have actually almost lost their jobs because of that. It's been incredibly serious. And much like gambling or drinking alcohol, you can get addicted. And also when the fun stops, stop. So if it's nasty, if it's unpleasant, if you're worried about it, if people are saying these awful things to you and it's bothering you, just get out. As I said, it's not worth it. Yes, it's fun. Yes, you can make connections. Yes, you can grow your audience, but it's not worth getting stressed about and getting upset by, and certainly not worth getting threatened by. So that's what I've always said to people. When the fun stops, stop. I've been on the verge of that a few times. I've kind of always gone back because I've still found enough use out of it to be able to ignore some of the bad side. But if that balance is far too much on the side of the unpleasant side, then just leave. The trolls, as we call them, people who are saying nasty or unpleasant things, just block them. You can block them so you don't have to interact with them. Always do that. I've never once regretted it. It's impossible to win an argument with these people. There's a saying, don't wrestle a pig because you'll both end up dirty and no one will win. Some of them don't even exist. So I mentioned the bots or the fake accounts. That's increasingly common, that actually they're not even real people. These are designed to agitate and cause arguments, sometimes by actual states or sometimes by people who just want to cause trouble. And don't expect Twitter or X to do anything about it because they won't. So you can report it, and they always talk about how they don't accept anti-Semitism or racism or abuse, but they do. They don't really do anything about it. So don't expect that. I found this online. This is what's called the bot farm. So these are people in places like China and Russia who are often professionally paid by state actors to actually agitate and cause trouble. They have these thousands of accounts which look real, but are designed to abuse, get involved in election campaigning, are designed to agitate, to outrage. So sometimes you'll see something online which you find disgusting or outrageous or racist or anti-Semitic or not true. Sometimes they're real people, but sometimes they're not. It's just these guys in their backyard who've been given a little bit of money just to say unpleasant things. Just remember that the next time you get some abuse online. Of course, Elon Musk has now taken over Twitter. He renamed it X. Some people will love him as a hero. Some people absolutely hate him. He's very controversial. He made big changes. For example, the blue V that I got initially because I was considered to be a reliable source on COVID, that now has become purely a paying service. So anyone can do that, which kind of defeats the purpose of it. So you have to be aware of that. And I would say there's probably more advertising and more bots and more fake stuff than ever before since he took over. So I think it's a little bit of a dip at the moment. I think inevitably it will come back and is worth sticking with. So when he took over, there was a kind of outrage from a lot of people who said they were going to leave. There were rival social networks, particularly in science, one called Mastodon, but inevitably it just didn't take off and people stopped using it because there's a critical mass on Twitter or X. It's just so big now. People don't want to start from the beginning, and I think it's here to stay. It's going to morph, it's going to change shape over the years, but for now I've decided to stick with it. So in summary, it's 10 minutes to the hour now, so I think I've spoken enough now. Just some tips, and overall, just think about how you're going to use this. Grow your audience and do it in a way that will be effective for your audience. Know your audience, know who you're talking to, ignore the trolls, and have fun. Make good connections like I have done here, and just enjoy it. And as soon as it stops being fun or stops being useful, just leave because we all have enough stress in our lives. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was fun or interesting or even useful for some people and maybe persuaded you to use it a little bit more. But I hope it was a little bit different. And thank you so much again for inviting me. I really enjoyed talking to you, and it's really nice to meet new people, especially from Israel. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
My name is Racheli. Maybe I'll switch to Hebrew. אז אני מהיוזרים האלה שאמרת שהם לא quality, כי יש לי חשבון ובעצם אני אף פעם לא שם, ואני כאילו תמיד יודעת שאני, את כל הדברים הטובים, האמת שהפתעת אותי עם כמה דברים שסיפרת היום, אבל הרבה מהדברים הטובים המקצועיים אני יודעת שכאילו אני יודעת על מה שקיים, ובעצם אני תמיד מרגישה שהבעיה שלי זה זמן, ושזה בעצם משהו שדורש השקעה, דורש זמן, וגם ככה אני מרגישה שאין לי מספיק זמן לקרוא את המאמרים שאני רוצה וכן הלאה. לא יודעת אם יש לך איזה מחשבות על זה, או איך אתה, אם יש לך זמנים מסוימים שאתה עובד על זה, או שחלק מהדברים נגיד העברת את ההתעדכנות המדעית שלך לשם, ואתה לא קורא מעיתונים, או איך אתה מנהל את זה?
זה נכון מאוד שזה דורש זמן, זה דורש זמן לעשות את זה טוב, וזה נכון. כאילו, אבל זה זמן בחבילות קטנות, זה כאילו 5 דקות פה, 5 דקות שם, וזה מצטבר כמובן. אז כן, זה דורש ממני יותר אבל את צריכה כאילו לשקול אם זה שווה לך, מה מקבלת מזה בחזרה, וכמה את מוכנה להשקיע בזה, וכמה זמן, כמו כל דבר בחיים. כאילו, זה בדיוק כמו כל דבר, you get out what you put in. כי אני מאוד מאוד פעיל שם, אפילו ברמה של התמכרות, אני חייב להגיד, אבל אני מקבל בזה המון. אבל למשל, כאילו, לקרוא מאמרים, זה מאוד מאוד יעיל מבחינתי. כי יש מישהו שהוא כבר קרא את זה לעומק, והוא כותב כאילו summary על כל הדברים החשובים. זה מאוד מאוד, בשבילי, זה מאוד time effective באמת. אז בשבילי זה מאוד עובד, זה טוב כאילו מבחינת זמן. אבל מצד שני זה דורש המון זמן, כאילו לעלות פוסטים וטוטוריאלס, נכון? אז פשוט צריכה לחשוב אם זה משתלם לך.
וכשהתחלת, עוד שאלה אחת, כשהתחלת בעצם אמרת שלא ציפית לכל התעודה הזאת,
כן.
מה בעצם הייתה המטרה הראשונית שלך כשהתחלת לפרסם את הדברים האלה? כאילו, אתה מדבר על האודיאנס ועל המסרים ועל הדברים האלה, אבל בעצם השאלה היא מההתחלה, וכך יש לך את הדבר הזה ברור, אני עושה פוסט-דוק בחול, אני הולכת כבר להיות חוקרת עצמאית, אתה יודע, יכול להיות שזה גם משתנה עם הזמן, אבל מעניין אותי אם כשהתחלת באיזה מין מטרה מסוימת, שבשביל עבדת או שזה התפתח?
התפתח ככה במקרה, התחלתי את זה בלי שום מטרה, זה רק היה כזה outlet, כאילו to vent. התחלת הפנדמיק והייתי את עצמי בתפקיד מאוד בכיר וכאילו חשבתי שזה גדול עליי ממש. אז בשביל זה היה ממש outlet, כאילו פשוט לכתוב על מה שאני רואה ומה שקורה, אז ממש כאילו לא ציפיתי לזה, זה היה במקרה, אבל זה ממש השתנה עם הזמן, כאילו הבנתי שיש בזה המון כוח, והרבה אנשים מתעניינים במה יש לי להגיד. שיניתי את הקונטנט שלי ואת התוכן שלי, וכן היום המטרה שלי זה כן לפרסם את העבודה שלי, ולעשות שרים בעולם המדע בעצם, אז הדברים השתנו. וכשהתחלתי ממש לא ציפיתי לזה בכלל, לא היה לי שום מטרה, סתם עשיתי בשביל, לא יודע, בשבילי.
תודה.
ניל, תודה רבה, היה מאוד מאוד מעניין. מעיין לא מצליחה להתחבר בחזרה, אין לה קליטה, היא ביקשה שאני אעשה מודריישן בשבילה כרגע. יש פה שאלה ממירון אבידן, What's the pros and cons of X-Twitter versus LinkedIn?
אני באמת לא משתמש בלינקדאין, אני מכיר הרבה אנשים שכן משתמשים בזה, אני חושב שזה פחות פעיל בעולם של מדע ורפואה. הרבה, כאילו, יש לי בני משפחה שהם בעולם הכלכלה ובנקים וכאלה. זה מאוד מאוד חזק שם, וזה בעיקר, זה לא סושיאל מדיה, זה ביזנס מדיה. זה בעיקר כאילו לחפש עבודה ושיתוף פעולה בפרויקטים וכאלה, אבל זה לא כמו, כאילו, אני באמת, אני לא משתמש בלינקדאין, אני לא מכיר אף אחד שאני מכיר בעבודה שמשתמש בזה, אז פשוט זה קהל שונה לגמרי, אז הם שונים, הם שונים. אני לא יודע על לינקדאין בכלל, האמת היא.
ולמשתמש חדש בטוויטר או ב-X, למשל כמוני, איך היית ממליץ לחפש אנשים בתחום שלי? אני בתחום למשל רפואת ריאות, אסתמה, GPA, איך אני יכול לחפש אנשים שמדברים על התחום שלי?
זה צד מאוד מאוד חזק בטוויטר, כי כל הזמן יש כאילו כל מיני אלגוריתמים ו-AI, וזה מופיע בסקרין שלך, מי ממליץ לעקוב אחריו. זה באמת מאוד מאוד מתאים לתחום שלך, וכאילו הספיישלטי שלך. אז זה מאוד מאוד פשוט לעשות את זה, ואיכשהו הם עשו את זה ממש ממש, כאילו, זה מאוד אפקטיבי ויעיל לחפש את האנשים שמאוד מאוד קשורים עליך ועל התחום שלך. אז אני עשיתי את זה בקלות. אתה יכול לעשות חיפוש, אסתמה, רספירטורי, ובשניות אתה תראה אנשים כאילו הגדולים בתחום, כאילו אנשים בכירים, פרופסורים, ולעקוב אחר. אז זה בקלות, זה מאוד מאוד פשוט לעשות את זה. תנסה.
אני בהחלט אנסה, אני בדיוק לפני חודש וחצי התחברתי לטוויטר לקראת ההרצאה, אז אני לשחק.
יופי, כן.
יש עוד שאלות מהקהל? בצ'אט אני רואה שאין עוד. יש עוד אנשים שמעוניינים לשאול שאלות? אוקיי. אז תודה רבה, ואני מקווה שמכאן אנשים יקחו את זה כדי לחזק את עצמם מבחינת ההתנהלות שלהם בעולם הרפואה הדיגיטלית, לא הדיגיטלית, ברשתות החברתיות יותר, נכון? ושהכלי הזה באמת עזר לאנשים, ומסיים סבוד אנחנו נמשיך לעדכן אתכם בעוד הרצאות שיהיו בהמשך, ושוב ניל, תודה רבה שהסכמת להשתתף.
יש עכשיו את האימייל שלי, ואני אשמח לעשות קשרים חדשים, וכמובן אתם יכולים לעקוב אחריי בטוויטר.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תודה, בדיוק חזרתי הקליטה ניאל, תודה רבה, היה מצוין, ממש, תודה.
בכיף.
ביי.
ביי.